Today is Constitution Day, which is September 17th, which celebrates the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. So they debated the Constitution in the summer of 1787, and then they had to get at least 9 states to sign off. And this date is when the 9th state decided to ratify the Constitution in 1788. So that's what we're celebrating today. Constitution is what gives us a president, the Supreme Court, Congress, elections, all of that. So it's an incredibly important document. Let me turn it over. I also want to thank a few people first before we start. I want to thank SAFAC, which is our student life organization that has helped fund this event entirely. We very much appreciate that, especially Michael Gregorish over in Student Life. I want to thank Betty Geiger and Brenda Carter in Academic Affairs, along with Julie, for all of their support and help putting this together. I want to thank my boss, which you should always do, Lee Powell, for just being an overall awesome guy and giving us his support for this event. And I want to thank my colleagues Tyler Young and Tiffany Cartwright. They also teach politics here. They're far superior than I am, so take their classes if you get a chance. And I want to turn over the microphone to our provost, Dr. John Hardesty. Thank you.
My name is John Hardesty. I'm the Vice President Provost for the campus, and I want to welcome you to this year's Constitution Day lecture. And I want to introduce you to Dr. David Azerrad. He's the director of the Kenneth Simon Center for Principles and Politics at the Washington, D.C.-based think tank, the Heritage Foundation. Dr. Azerrad is an expert in political philosophy, the political thought of the American founding, and modern American politics. His writings have appeared in various publications, including the Claremont Review of Books, the Weekly Standard, National Affairs, the Times of London, Real Clear Politics, the Federalist, the National Interest, and Interpretation, a journal of political philosophy. He frequently appears on national television news programs in the United States, Canada, and the UK. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Azerrad.
Thank you, everyone. It's very nice to be back home in Texas. As you can tell from my accent, I'm not from here. But when I moved to the U.S. in 2004 to go to grad school, I went to the University of Dallas, not too far from here. And I still fell in love with America and decided I was not going back to Canada. And even though I ended up going to D.C. because that's where I found a job, I consider Texas my home state. So it's very nice to be here. I'm delighted to be here with you today to celebrate Constitution Day, which I will admit when I moved to the U.S., at first I thought, now this is a strange holiday. Why is it that these Americans are celebrating Constitution Day? In Canada, we don't have a Constitution Day. In fact, I'm pretty sure that if you ask most Canadians, do they even have a Constitution? What does it say? They wouldn't know. I mean, I grew up in Canada. I went to school there. I went to grad school there. I studied political science, mind you. And I am, well, maybe a little bit ashamed to admit that I have no idea what the opening words of the Canadian Constitution are, how many articles it has, how many amendments. I don't know anything about it, and I suspect most Canadians don't. Now, that said, I think if you ask the Canadian about the national holiday, the Canadian equivalent of your 4th of July, everyone would get that, right? Every country has a national holiday. That's perfectly understandable. Right here in the US, if you immigrate and you hear about the 4th of July, you're like, oh yeah, this makes sense. This is their day of independence. This is the day that America proclaimed independence from Great Britain and announced the great principles that would define this nation from here onward. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Why then is there a separate holiday for the Constitution? Well, I think it has to do with the fact that if you think about it, in a certain sense, it is not that hard to proclaim your independence, to proclaim rights, and even to win your independence. A lot of nations have had revolutions. A lot of nations have fought off someone, gained their independence, and a lot of nations have proclaimed all sorts of rights. It's a very easy thing to do, to proclaim the rights, and it's hard to win a revolution, but it's not unique. Where things get really interesting is, what do you do with your freedom? How do you now set up a government that doesn't devolve into a tyranny, into a military dictatorship, into a president for life? That is much harder. And look, we should know because, and I say we now as an American. I'm not yet an American, but I very much aspire to become one. So forget about the Canadian side. I'm now speaking as an American. We took a first crack at it, and we failed miserably. Does anyone here remember or know the name of our first Constitution? Yeah.
The Articles of Confederation.
The Articles of Confederation, which we had from 1781 to 1789 when the Constitution came into effect. They created a very weak and feckless central government. The states were misbehaving in all sorts of ways. Now, many countries, you could say, that would have been the end of the story. Independence, bad government, and it devolves into tyranny or it breaks down. We got a second crack at it. And so one summer in Philadelphia in 1787, they produced this Constitution, which is still here with us today. When Thomas Jefferson saw it, he called it unquestionably the wisest Constitution yet presented to men. 232 years later, it remains the oldest written national constitution in continuous use in the world. There's only one written constitution that is older than ours. Does anyone know what it is? Yes?
Iceland's constitution was written in the 1900s.
I'm not familiar with that one, so maybe I stand to be corrected. Based on what I know, ours in continuous use, you notice I said, there are older written constitutions, but they have not been in continuous use. The only constitution that is older than ours that has been in continuous use is that of Massachusetts. But Massachusetts is not a state, it's not a sovereign nation. So we have the oldest written national constitution in continuous use. And it's also the most distinctively American of our founding documents. Look, the Declaration of Independence has the British Enlightenment written all over it. Jefferson literally plagiarized 2 passages from John Locke, something I don't advise you do when you do your papers for your professors. The Constitution, by contrast, is a distinctively American document. There's no beta version of it in the writings of European philosophers. It is the product of the American mind. And to this day, even though it's sometimes forgotten or taken for granted, it secures our liberties and it remains central to our way of life. And so for these reasons, I think it is fitting that we Americans celebrate Constitution Day. Now, if you turn to our national politics, if you look at Washington, D.C., where I live, you oftentimes don't hear much about the Constitution. In fact, I don't know how closely some of you follow our national politics, but you may be inclined to think that there isn't much that is going on that is all that edifying, period, much less about the Constitution. I suspect many of you may think that our politics is a bit of a circus. The tweets, the insults, the short attention spans, the constant state of hysteria of everyone. I think you could conclude, as one of my students once told me in a very artful way, that American politics is dumb. I disagree with that judgment. I do readily concede that there is a circus that is going on. But what I hope to show you today is that if you look beneath it, you will find that beneath all of the circus, there are some very interesting and important questions that are being raised and debated. And all it requires from you to see them is just to go a little bit beyond the surface. And I think it is incumbent upon all of us as citizens or as people like me who aspire to become citizens to get a better grasp of our politics. And so what I propose today to do today is to, maybe it's a tall order, I don't know if I'll succeed, but it's to take a crack at trying to convince you that there are some interesting and important things happening in American politics beneath, just below the surface of what seems to be the circus that we see in the media every day. So let's begin with the most obvious starting point, okay? The biggest cliche of them all that even a high schooler would know. We are very divided as a people. Our politics is very divisive. Everyone knows that. Now here's where it's getting interesting. We are so divided that we don't even agree about the nature of our divisions. I find this very interesting. Let me give you a few examples. Say we talk to Bernie Sanders, the independent senator from Vermont, who's running for president, and we ask them, Senator Sanders, tell Willis, what is the nature of the division in America politically? What would he say? It's who versus who, which group versus which group?
Rich versus poor.
The rich versus the poor. The 1% versus the 99%. Say we spoke to Stacey Abrams. So she is the woman who ran for governor of the state of Georgia in 2018. She didn't win the election, but she is then a pretty big name in the Democratic Party. She was asked to offer the official Democratic Party response to President Trump's State of the Union in January. She would say something along the lines, actually, the fundamental division in American politics is between women, people of color, the LGBTQ, minorities, and then on the other hand, basically the institutions of structural racism, white privilege, and the patriarchy. So she is more on the identity politics side of things. Say we look at the right. Do you remember when Mitt Romney ran for president in 2012? He made a very infamous off-the-cuff comment that generated a lot of backlash. Do you remember what his division was? It wasn't the 1% versus the 99%. It was the 47% versus the 53%. He claimed there are 53% of Americans who are paying taxes, 47% who aren't or who are net recipient of government benefits. And that's the division. The makers and the takers. The productive ones and those who are wards of the state. And then you have Donald Trump, who mounted this most improbable campaign in 2016. And for him, the division seems to be the bigs. Big donors, big corporations, big media, established politicians, the ruling class, and then ordinary Americans. Oddly enough, Trump, who is a Republican, revived a phrase from the greatest Democrat president of the 20th century, FDR. He started speaking of the forgotten men and women of this country. So here you have four politicians from two different parties who can't seem to agree on what the division is. So I'm left wondering, is it race? Is it sex? Is it class? And if it's class, how do you define class? Is it how much you earn? Is it whether or not you went to college? Is it how you see the world? Maybe it's where you live. After all, we're told that we have red states and blue states. But then when you start to look at a map, you realize that that's not really the case. We actually have blue cities and red the rest of the country. So which is it? Is it any one of them? Maybe it's a combination of all of them. We don't agree. And this disagreement over the source of our disagreements is not just a partisan one. This is not the left versus the right, the Republicans versus the Democrats. It cuts across the parties. It divides the left and it divides the right. Now, the right is ultimately much more divided than the left in America for two reasons. The first one is that Trump did basically a semi-hostile takeover of the Republican Party. I say semi-hostile because the Republican electorate voted for him and liked him and continues to like him. But the Republican establishment and conservative intellectuals did not like him at all. They viewed him as a usurper, and you can understand why they did. This is not a man who came from the Republican Party. He used to be a Democrat. He had run as an independent beforehand. He came along, got the nomination, and there was, and remains to this day, a lot of opposition to Trump within Republican and conservative elites. The Never Trump movement, for example, came from the right, not from the left. And then the other reason that the right is more divided than the left today is that the left has a clear mission, which is get rid of Trump. They all are united on this priority, and as a result, when you have a common enemy and you are pressed to do something, that kind of leads you to paper over, at least for a while, your differences. So what I propose to do today with you is not to settle these questions. I'm not going to tell you who I think is right, who I think is wrong, in part because I don't fully know, and also because I want you to think for yourselves. What I propose to do is to explain to you these divisions, and then we will have, I would like to think, plenty of time for robust questions, conversations, and we can hopefully all walk away seeing things a little bit more clearly. I'll begin with the left and look at the two main ideological factions on the left, identity politics and kind of traditional progressivism. And then I'll look at what's happening on the right, the tension between traditional fusionist conservatism and then Trumpist populist nationalism. So let's begin with the left. And on the left, I'll begin with identity politics because I think it's the most powerful ideology in America today. It permeates our culture. It fuels this national obsession we have in America with ensuring that there's diversity everywhere, which we have come to understand as the proportional representation in all realms of life of the various identity groups that we recognized. Women, African Americans, Hispanic, the LGBTQs. There was a push under the Obama administration to add a new group called MINAs. I don't know if you heard about this. This would be Middle Easterners and North Africans. They wanted to create a separate category so that they would not be considered white. It didn't work out, so they are now lumped in with the whites. It's everywhere in our laws, in our legal system. We have affirmative action, we have racial preferences, we have disparate impact analysis, we have hate crime statutes that punish crimes that were motivated by hate more harshly than other crimes. And it just casts a very long shadow on all of our political debates. I think all of you know that in America today, yes, we have the First Amendment and we can speak our minds, but we all need to be extremely careful not to say something that someone finds sexist, offensive, or racist. This is how you lose your job in America today. This is how you get your name forever besmirched on the internet and how you become unhireable. I don't know if you heard, just this week, Saturday Night Live had hired a comedian named Shane Gillis. I'd never heard of him. And it turns out that in a podcast a few years ago, he had made an off-color joke about Asians. And they fired him on the spot before he ever started. Identity politics is an extremely powerful force in American politics, and I think the key to understanding it is that it's not really a politics of identity. It's really a politics of oppression. Because one thing you realize when you start to follow identity politics is that not all identities are created equal. Not every group gets to have an identity that they are proud of. Not every group gets a museum on the mall, a special history month, a congressional caucus. Only the groups that are considered to have been oppressed. Women, racial minorities, LGBTQ, so on and so forth. So it creates a political system that says some identities are good. If you're claimed to be oppressed, yours is a good identity. We celebrate it. We encourage pride in it. But if you belong to a bad group, if you're white, if you're Christian, if you're male, if you're straight, you don't get to have an identity that you celebrate. To the extent that we speak of your identity, it's to have you apologize for what your group has done to others in the past. So it creates this disequilibrium in the system where it's not everyone gets to have an identity and we're trying to get a slice of the pie. It really is a division between the good and the bad identities. And this way of thinking has come to dominate in the Democratic Party. It is not the only way to look at things, but it really is the dominant one. I would say that the priority in the Democratic Party today in America is to help out the traditionally oppressed and marginalized groups. And not what the Democratic Party was, let's say up until the 1970s, not what the Democratic Party was under FDR, which was the party of the working class, the party of the middle class, the party of the poor. And you see it, for example, do you guys remember what is the most infamous thing that Hillary Clinton said in 2016? She referred to half of Trump's voters as being in a basket of deplorables. And what I think she really had in mind there were, working class white people who live in flyover country. She had no sympathy for them because she saw these people as being basically racists. People who, as President Obama said in a different context, cling to their guns and their religion. And so one thing you're starting to see on the Democratic Party, I'll return to that, is a bit of a lack of sympathy for certain Americans who are not doing well because they don't have the right skin color or the right gender or the right gender identity. This, I think, is the dominant way of looking at politics in the Democratic Party. It is not the only way. The old way of doing democratic politics, basically looking at classes. The rich guys are the bad ones versus the poor, the middle class, the working class, and we the Democrats are the party of everyone else. This still exists. The main champion of that way of looking at things, as I mentioned, is Bernie Sanders. And here's where it gets interesting. Is Bernie Sanders a Democrat? No, he's an independent, which I find telling. He is, in a sense, the most democratic in terms of what the Democratic Party used to be, but he is no longer a Democrat. If you read his speeches, if you follow him on Twitter, the division for him is pretty clear. He doesn't deny that there's racism in America and that we should watch for the rights of LGBTQ, of women, of immigrants. But his heart, his priority is going after the banks, going after the big corporations, going after the wealthy, and standing for the working class men and women of this country. He sounds like John Edwards for the older people in the room who remember his campaign, right? He sees two Americas, an America that is rich and America that is living paycheck to paycheck. And the good guys for Sanders, as I said, and for many other Democrats, I don't want to suggest this is exclusive to him, is our solidarity lies with the working, middle, and poor classes, regardless of their skin color, regardless of their sexual orientation, regardless of their religion. We really look at it through income and wealth, and that's it. Now, one thing you'll hear a lot is that, oh, this is socialism. This is a very popular talking point on the right, is to say Bernie Sanders is a socialist. They want to transform America into the Soviet Union. I don't think this is entirely correct. What socialism is fundamentally is the government controlling the means of production, the abolition of the private sector. I think if you look at the main thrust of what Sanders wants is, he wants higher taxes on the rich, tighter regulations on the private sector to make sure that corporations are not polluting or mistreating their workers, and he wants more entitlements. He looks at America and he says, look, we spend a lot on the poor, we spend a lot on the elderly. What we don't do that other advanced democracies do is middle-class entitlements. He wants free healthcare, free daycare, paid leave, free college. The goal is really a romanticized version of Sweden rather than the Soviet Union. I say a romanticized version of Sweden because Sweden in many regards is more conservative than America. They have universal school choice, they don't allow elective late-term abortions, they have private health care, they do not grant citizenship to the children of illegal aliens, but for some reason this never figures into Bernie Sanders' account of the country. So these are, as I've sketched them out, kind of the two main ways of looking at things in the Democratic Party and on the left. On most days, as I said, the two get along pretty well. There's a fair amount of agreement, and I think the person who embodies this is really Elizabeth Warren. She is kind of a fusion of these two ways of looking at things. If you read her speeches, she says, here's what I'm going to do for women, the LGBTQ, Hispanics, African Americans, immigrants, and then she switches to, and here's what I'm going to do to the corporations. Here's what I'm going to do to the wealthy, and here's what I'm going to do for the working class, for the poor, for everyone else. So these two ideologies on most days kind of get along. One, as I said, because both of them are in agreement that we need to get rid of Trump, and also because there are certain similarities. Both of them divide America between weak, oppressed groups. They define them differently, and then powerful, privileged groups. Again, they define them differently, but there's a broad agreement that the point of politics is to redistribute wealth, power, and honor from the weak to the powerful. So both are fundamentally redistributionist at their core. There are some tensions, and I'll mention them briefly in passing because I find they're very interesting. The two big tensions you see on the left between these two ways of looking at the world where they can't be harmonized. One is, what do you do with working class white people who live in broken towns in flyover America, who have a rising suicide rate, a declining life expectancy because people are dying from opioids, and who live in towns where there aren't all that many jobs? If you look at America through the lens of identity politics, you say, these people have white privilege. But if you look at it through the more traditional progressive lens, you say, no, they don't. I mean, they're, poor Americans who are living in pretty crappy conditions. So one issue that the left is going to need to decide, that the Democratic Party is going to need to decide, is how much sympathy and solidarity do you have with members of the working class who are white men? Are they privileged because they're white men? Or are they not privileged because, the economy is not doing too well for them and they're hurting in all sorts of ways? The other interesting tension is, how do you view corporate America? So if you're Bernie Sanders, if you're Elizabeth Warren, they have no particular love for big corporations. They think that these big corporations are taking advantage of their workers, that they're not paying enough taxes, and they want to go after them. They want them to pay higher taxes. Elizabeth Warren complains about the conditions in warehouses that Amazon sets up. And she says it is not enough that Amazon celebrates Black History Month. It is not enough that Amazon flies the gay flag on its homepage when it's Pride Month. Amazon needs to take good care of its workers. It is not enough that Amazon hired all of these women and minorities in the C-suite. We want better conditions for the workers. Whereas I think that the wing of the party that is more enamored with identity politics is more taken in by, look, what I really want to know is, are you on board with diversity? Are you hiring enough women, enough minorities? Are you celebrating Black History Month, Pride Month? And then, I don't pay as much attention to your tax rate or to how you're treating workers. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the expression woke capitalism. This is something that has started to be talked about in recent years. It's the argument that the big corporations in America are woke when it comes to social justice. But the rejoinder, I think, from someone like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and the more traditional wing of the party would be, yes, but they're still capitalists. And we're not taken in by the superficial diversity. We care about the conditions of their workers and whether or not they're paying their fair share of taxes. So I think, to me, these are the two interesting tensions that you see on the left and in the Democratic Party that are worth paying attention to see how they will play out. And one thing I'll mention is, if the Democratic Party wants to win elections, they need a share of the white working class. Their model isn't enough to completely exclude them, and so they're going to need, I think, to keep, I'm not in the business of making political predictions, I'm not a strategist, I'm not even a citizen, but I think that what Elizabeth Warren is doing is probably what is going to be the way forward for the Democratic Party, which is a combination of these two strands in an attempt to kind of take the edge off of the extremes of each one. Now, let's turn in the second half of the talk to what is happening in the Republican Party. So let's look at the state of the Republican Party before the Hurricane Trump hit on January 2015, when he came down the escalator of Trump Tower and everything was upset and transformed. If you looked at what the party was, it was basically a traditional fusionist conservative party. Why do I say fusionist? Because it attempted to bring together three strands of conservatism. So the traditional description was, the Republican Party is a three-legged stool. One leg of the stool is fiscal conservatism. The other leg of the stool is social conservatism. And the third leg of the stool is military foreign policy conservatism. Allow me to explain. The party, as it understood itself, and by the way, many continue to understand it this way. Remember, as I told you, Trump did a semi-hostile takeover of the party. Is that, well, what do we Republicans believe? Well, on the economic front, we believe in limited government. We believe in free markets. We believe in capitalism. We want lower taxes, deregulation. We want to unleash entrepreneurship, growth, and we want the government to get out of the way. Less government, more liberty, more growth, more wealth for everyone. Then they would say, we are also a socially conservative party, which broadly has meant pro-life, pro-religious liberty, and pro-marriage. Now, on marriage, the Republicans lost completely after the Obergefell decision in 2013, in which the Supreme Court recognized a right to gay marriage in the Constitution that kind of put an end to that plank of social conservatism, and social conservatives conceded their defeat, so that today really what the social conservative wing of the party really means is being pro-life. That's why you are hard-pressed to find a prominent Republican who is not pro-life. Even Donald Trump, who does not come from a pro-life background, and I don't know what's in his heart, but, well, I'm not going to judge, I don't know what's in people's heart, but let's just say, color me skeptical as to how pro-life he is personally, felt the need to present himself as pro-life, because the party is pro-life, and then they are very much pro-religious liberty. That we want to protect the rights of conscience for all Americans, but it primarily manifests itself for the rights of conscience of Christians, who are a large part of the Republican base. And then the third leg of that stool is conservatives and Republicans want a military that is well-funded and an American foreign policy that is actively engaged in advancing American interests all across the world. One term you will hear is interventionist. I'm not very fond of that term because I think it's a little bit silly. Intervene on behalf of what? And I would say that traditionally, what I will admit is that the Republican Party and the conservatives have had a pretty broad understanding of the American national interest. That America had a role to play in promoting democracy abroad. Under President Bush, it became building democracies abroad, nation building. If you want to read, I guess, the most extreme statement of that, read President Bush's second inaugural address, in which he said that the goal of American foreign policy is to end tyranny in the world. That America had to topple every last dictatorship and build democracies everywhere. And if you want to get an illustration of how these three things come together, look at Ronald Reagan, who really has been, and I think remains, the beau ideal, the great statesman that Republicans look up to. And he combined all three of these things. He gave us Reaganomics, tax cuts, deregulation, and a pretty massive economic boom. He was socially conservative. A lot of people don't know this, but President Reagan only wrote one book in his life, and it was a short book on abortion. And he invested heavily in a military buildup and actively confronted the Soviet Union and brought about their collapse and the end of the Cold War. And I think if you look at the party before Trump, and honestly even post-Trump, most Republican members of Congress will talk like this. They will speak of fiscal conservatism, social conservatism, and a strong military. Now, how they govern is a completely other matter. I'll say this in passing because it's an interesting feature of American politics, is what you'll find is, you know, they'll say, yes, we believe in limited government and more liberty and we need to cut the government. But then when it comes time to governing, the American people like their enlightenments. You got a lot of lobbyists in Washington, D.C. who want to meet with you and are giving you money if you do stuff for them. And so you find that when it comes time to governing, most of them talk a pretty big game about, we're going to cut this and cut that, but they don't deliver all that much. They end up settling on, well, look, whatever the Dems want, except maybe, I don't know, a little bit less of it. So there is a sense in which the establishment Republican Party, are you guys familiar with the insult rhino? You heard this? He's a Republican in name only. He's a rhino. He's a squish. This is a term of insult on the right directed at Republicans in government saying, yeah, you guys told us, you were told us you were going to do all of this, but you didn't do it once you came into office. So you've had this tension. And then, June 15th, 2015, Trump Tower. Donald Trump comes down the escalator and the earthquake begins. I mean, call it a 7.5 on the Richter scale. And he disrupts everything. And he's still disrupting everything to this day. And I was talking to one of your professors beforehand, and I said, are they going to ask questions? And he said, well, I don't know. You'll see. Depends on what you said. I said, well, I'll try to say a few provocative things to make sure that no one is shy and that they ask me some good questions. So here's the provocative thing I'm going to say. I realized that Donald Trump is quite the character and that he invokes very strong emotions in people. I realized that he sucks up all of the oxygen in the room all the time. I realize that it is very tempting to dismiss him as a Yahoo. as a guy who loves attention, is not disciplined, and is just tweeting at 5 a.m. from the Oval Office based on whatever pops into his mind. Here is the radical idea I am putting forward for you today to spark conversation. Donald Trump has ideas, and we should pay attention to them. I am not here to defend every last one of his tweets. I don't think that's possible. I'm not even here to defend all of his ideas. I am here to encourage you to give me 5 minutes of breathing room to hear me out on this crazy idea that beyond the tweets, the insults to the media, the fake news as he does to them when he has the press conferences in the Rose Garden, there actually is a coherent worldview. There are some principles that inform his thinking. And broadly speaking, I think they are populism and nationalism. Now, both of these terms have a lot of baggage. So allow me to explain them to you, and then we'll open it up to questions. What do I mean by populism? I mean, populism is a term that a lot of people say populism is a code word for racism, it's a code word for white nationalism. I don't think that's what's going on with Trump. I take populism to be a way of looking at politics that says, look, the fundamental division is between the elites, the ruling class, and ordinary, average people. And the elites have a lot of power, and they are governing in such a way that is not beneficial to the people broadly construed. Now, you could say, but hold on one second, isn't that what Sanders is saying? And I would say, Sanders is also a populist. Both Trump and Sanders are populists. By the way, what does it say about our politics that the two most energetic, exciting candidates that most got their base fired up in 2016 were outsiders who were populists, who ran against all of the established, well-credentialed, experienced people in their parties. The difference between Sanders and Trump comes down to how do you define the elites? What do you mean by the ruling class? Sanders defines it by income, assets, and wealth. It's the 1%. It's how much you make, how much you earn, how much you have. In Trump's case, it's a bit more nebulous and less precisely defined, but it basically amounts to how much power do you have? How do you look at the world? Where do you live? Let me give you an example. If you went to Sarah Lawrence College and you majored in women's studies, and you're now just making, I don't know, $47,000 blogging for the New York Times, but you think that America is a patriarchy, you think that America has institutional racism, according to Bernie Sanders, you are part of the people. You're part of the 99%. According to Trump and the populist, you would have to say, actually, you're part of the elites, because you look at the world through the same lens that the elites look at the world. You have a certain contempt for ordinary Americans. You look down upon them. And it's true that you're not a Goldman Sachs banker who's making a lot of money, but you share their same prejudices. You live in big cities with them, you went to fancy schools like they do, and you have the same condescension vis-a-vis Americans who didn't go to college and live in the rest of the country. By contrast, say you live in Denton, you go to church on Sundays, you got guns at home, but you have a very successful car dealership and you're making $6 million a year. According to Bernie Sanders, you're a 1%er. You're part of the elites. According to the populists and Trump, actually no. Income-wise, you may be part of the elites, but you do not share their prejudices. You are aligned with the American people, broadly construed. And Trumpist populism says, in this context, in this contest, in this division between the elites and the people, we are on the side of the people. We defend them. Now, you may scoff and say, hold on one second, Azerrad, you gotta be kidding me. He's a billionaire from New York who went to Wharton, and you're claiming he's a populist? Remember, I'm defining populism not just by whether or not you went to college, where you live, and how much money you make, but primarily by how do you look at the world? How do you view the rest of the country? And I think Trump, I don't think that's the way he would put it, is basically a traitor to his class. He comes from New York, he's a billionaire, he went to Wharton, and his sympathy and solidarity lies not with the other millionaires in New York, but with the people who reside in what is dismissively called flyover country. A term which, by the way, I really detest, and I find is deeply condescending. So we have coasts and big cities where the sophisticated people live, and then we have flyover country. So I think this is what populism means for Trump. And by the way, he didn't invent it. For the older people in the room, Trump is in the wake of Ross Perot and Pat Buchanan. There has been this populist streak on the right that predates Trump, and this, I strongly predict, will outlast Trump. And then the second thing, I think, to understanding this new movement on the right is that it's nationalist. Now, what do I mean by nationalist? This is another one of these terms that can mean different things. One thing that nationalism can mean is, I don't have a country, I want one. So where I'm from in Quebec, in Canada, we have been wanting to separate from Canada for a while now. We have not been very good at it. We've had 2 referenda. We failed each time, and so we remain part of Canada. And if you tell someone I'm a Québécois nationalist, or a Catalan nationalist, or a Basque nationalist, people say, okay, I get that, you want your own country. Clearly, this is not what's going on here. America's already a sovereign country. Then, of course, there is the bad, racist, violent nationalism of the Nazis, which is about building an empire and purifying the race. Clearly, this is not, I think, what is going on with Trump. So we're left with the third definition of nationalism, which I view as it really needs to be understood in a 21st century context, where there is a rise of a class of people who say borders don't matter anymore. I'm a citizen of the world. Borders are outdated. Countries are outdated. We want the easiest possible flow of people, goods, and services. We want to get rid of countries. We either want world government, or basically you keep the countries as administrative subunits, but you encourage people to transcend these narrow parochial attachments. And I view this brand of nationalism that Trump embodies, but that again is not unique to him. I mean, Pat Buchanan was saying the same thing in the 90s and in the 80s. The argument here is no, countries matter. Our primary allegiance is to our country and our countrymen. We can have hyphenated Americans, but we need to emphasize the American part. We can travel, we can trade with the world, we can sign treaties, but we can never lose sight of the fact that we are Americans first, that we must defend the national interest first and foremost. There's a British journalist, David Goodhart, who wrote a book in which he has, I found it was a very useful prism to think about this. He says, if you look at Western nations, because by the way, what is happening in America today is also happening in Europe. These populist nationalist currents are also happening there. And his analysis is, we're starting to see a division in the West between 2 groups of people, the anywheres and the somewheres. The anywheres are the people who went to big schools, live in big cities, and are very comfortable, going from Paris to London to New York to Berlin, because they work for Goldman Sachs and they can just rotate around the office. And then the somewheres are the people who don't want to leave their country, who don't even want to leave their hometown, who are rooted in a particular place. And Goodhart's analysis, which I think applies to America, he wrote it particularly in the context of England, is same thing is going on here. We're seeing this division between the people primarily who congregate in the big cities and who, it's not that they dislike the country, but they feel less attached to it. They feel more interconnected in the global economy. And then the remainder of the people who remain much more rooted and attached to a particular country. I think the big question right now for the Republican Party is, do you go in this direction of more populism, more nationalism? Do you follow Trump? Do you look beyond Trump and say, look, Trump will be gone. He may lose this election, or he'll definitely won't even be permitted to run for the next one. Do we go back to what things were before Trump came along, which is more of the Mitt Romney view that I talked about? We're the party of entrepreneurs. We're the party of people who are building companies and, investing in the economy. Or are you doing what Trump is saying, which is, no, we're the party of the working class. We're the party of the average Joe. And I don't think the Republican Party has fully made up its mind. As I said, I'm not going to make a prediction as to where this all goes. I'll end by quoting my favorite American philosopher, Yogi Berra, who once said, I hate making predictions, especially about the future. So I'm not going to make any predictions about the future. I will leave you by reiterating what I said in the beginning, that as someone who studies politics for a living, I find that this is such an interesting time to be alive in America, to see these very serious, interesting, profound, and important questions being debated in our parties. I will readily concede that they're not always debated in the most edifying, lofty way with the most decorum. But in the pages of opinion journals, in the think tanks, in the universities, there are these extremely interesting debates that are taking place between the right, across the right, with the left and the right. And I hope that what I said this morning can perhaps encourage you to agree with me that it's worth looking beyond the circus once in a while to see what is happening in the politics of our country. Thank you very much.
Hello.
Hi.
So I consider myself pretty moderate. The only thing I'm not.
Don't move to Washington, by the way, if that.
When it comes to free healthcare and subsidizing healthcare, I kind of think about universities. In this country, whenever universities started getting subsidized, instead of actually making it so that they were cheaper, universities raised their prices, student debt went up, astronomically.
Yep.
I kind of see, if the government starts to subsidize healthcare, the healthcare industry already is, making so much money, continuing the opioid crisis. I feel like maybe, subsidizing and free healthcare is not the solution, but maybe something else is, finding alternate care, forms of care, I hate to say it, legalization of marijuana. I don't know why that isn't a thing already, but.
Well, I got plenty of, but I'll finish your question. I'll give you plenty of reasons why I think it's a terrible idea.
To legalize marijuana?
Yes.
Well, here's.
So first of all, finish your question and then let me answer the healthcare and tell you kids why you shouldn't smoke weed.
It's not that. It's that. Do you think that really, if we got free healthcare and subsidize it fully, that it's going to help Americans, or is it going to increase the
cost?
Yeah, the cost and how much money that these opioid companies.
Yes. I think that's an excellent question. A quick point on the weed. I am vehemently opposed to marijuana. If you wanted to design a drug that would crush your ambitions and make you comfortable being mediocre, you could not think of a better drug. I am open to the idea of decriminalizing marijuana. I don't think we should legalize. So there's a difference between decriminalize and legalize. Decriminalize would be you wouldn't be arrested or sent to jail if you had a small amount of weed on you, but it wouldn't be sold and advertised as if this is the same thing as coffee or bread. So, public service announcement, don't smoke weed. Now, to your question about healthcare. Look, I come from a country that has free healthcare, right? We all know that there's no such thing as anything free. We have government-paid healthcare. One thing you need to keep in mind with healthcare is that the demand for healthcare is unlimited because our bodies fall apart and we get sick, and especially when you get old. The number of things that you need done to you are unlimited. Regrettably, the amount of healthcare has to be limited. There is nothing unlimited in this world. So here is the fundamental problem of healthcare in any society. You have an unlimited demand for healthcare, and an inherently limited supply of healthcare. So what do you do? Well, one approach, the Canadian approach, is the free healthcare. But what that means is you have to ration. The government cannot give everyone all this free healthcare because it can't afford it. So you need to begin to ration. You need to have pretty long times to see a specialist. Look, I'm Canadian, I speak from first-hand experience. There are things to be said on behalf of our system, but one thing you should know as Americans is that we need to wait a lot. And I've been in the US 15 years, I've had private insurance, either that I bought on my own or that my employer provides to me. One thing that never ceases to amaze me is I never need to wait. And I call my family back home, like, I need to go see an ENT doctor, 3 days. And they're like, what? It's 9 months here. So it is also the case that not only do you need to ration, but it puts massive, massive fiscal pressure on the system. Especially with the elderly. People are living older and older, longer and longer, and they demand more and more healthcare. And then to your point, the more you subsidize something, as a rule of thumb, the more people want it and the cost will go up. I mean, if you look at the cost of living index from the 1970s until today, the price of a television has collapsed, of an iPhone has collapsed, of a whole bunch of things have collapsed. The two things that have shot through the roof are healthcare and education. Primarily for the reasons you suggest. Now that said, I do think we should subsidize healthcare because we have fellow Americans and I am concerned with their well-being. So we have accepted as a society that we will not allow the elderly to go without care. It's called Medicare. We've accepted the idea that we will not allow the very poor to go without care. It's called Medicaid. We now have a problem in this country where we have a population of people, about 30 million people, who don't have insurance, they can't find insurance, some of them don't want it, there's the pre-existing conditions issue. It doesn't seem to me to be illegitimate to ask ourselves, how do we help our fellow Americans? And this is where I think it's possible to develop some free market solutions, and this is really where the right has been in recent years, is the attempt to basically say, let's keep markets because markets are good at improving quality and bringing down costs, but we will subsidize those who cannot participate in a market by helping them purchase health insurance. So the delivery of healthcare will continue to be in private hands, but we will keep private health insurance but help people purchase it who can't. And this is a way to ensure access while somehow containing costs. That being said, one thing you should keep in mind is there is no perfect system. There is no such thing as a system in which everyone has perfect healthcare all the time. It's just not possible. But I think we have a pretty good system in America, but that we probably could improve it. Not probably, we definitely could improve it. One is at the level of Medicare. Medicare is going to bankrupt this country. It is a serious problem. All the young people here in the room, I hope you realize, in all likelihood, we are not getting Medicare and Social Security. The math just doesn't work. And then to do something to help those of our fellow Americans who are neither elderly nor very poor, but are kind of excluded from the markets. That said, exactly what we should do, I don't know because I'm not a healthcare specialist. I'm still pretty young and I'm not all that interested in healthcare, to be quite honest with you. Yes, sir.
I'm just curious about a statement that was made at the last debate, and where you think...
The Democratic debate?
Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. And where you think this shifts Beto O'Rourke's political ideology. The statement was, hell yes, we're going to take their AR-15s and AK-47s.
Yes, so the gentleman was asking in the last Democratic debate, he referred to him as Beto O'Rourke. I prefer to call him Robert Francis O'Rourke. Last time I checked, that's his name. He's wanting to present himself as something that he's not. He made this statement about, we're going to take your AR-15s. So it's interesting to note that when he ran for the Senate seat, that is most emphatically not what he said. I point this out in passing. When he wanted a Senate seat in Texas, that's not what he told Texans. Now he wants the Democratic Party nomination. He made this statement. Let me just tell you this. I have a lot of friends who are Democrats and are not happy with that statement because they feel that it paints them as extremists. And one thing that I find, I will confess, is to broaden your question, as I've followed these last 3 debates that the Democrats have had, is I think it could be pretty easy to beat Trump. Yeah, the economy is doing well, but he doesn't have a particularly high approval rating, and a lot of people really, really hate him. And they are tired of the state of our politics, and if someone could come along and say, hey, I'm going to do back to normal. You remember the good old days of Biden and Obama and even Bush, right? When we kind of all get along, I'm going to give you a back to normalcy. I think a lot of Americans might go for that. And what is odd about what's happening in the Democratic Party so far is, instead of doing that, they seem to be going farther and farther to the left. So the O'Rourke statement about we're going to take our guns. The first debate, we're not only going to do Medicare for all, we're going to give free health care to illegal aliens. Borders are racist. We want to allow anyone who wants to come here to be able to come here. Bernie Sanders is saying, I don't just want to give voting rights to felons. I want to allow incarcerated felons to vote. You would think if the point is to position yourself as a more sensible person than Donald Trump, you would not be saying these things. And yet they keep on saying them, which, look, I don't know why the Democrats would listen to a fellow who works at the Heritage Foundation for advice on how to win elections, but I don't think it's very prudent, because it plays into Trump's hands. He's going to paint them as extremists. One of my friends wrote an op-ed for the New York Times with the very clever title, "The winner of the Democratic Party debates so far, Donald Trump." Because a lot of Americans may say, look, yeah, is Trump a bit crazy? Yeah, but we've gotten used to him. Okay, he's been here for 3 years. He talks a lot of stuff, but the country's going pretty well. The economy's doing okay. These guys we've kind of gotten to know Trump and learned to live with him. These people are proposing things that I'm not comfortable with. So, one thing people may say was, look, this is the primary. They're catering to the base. They want to signal, I'm a real progressive, and then whoever gets the nomination is going to move to the center. That is one possibility, but it's also a possibility that you say so many things during the primary that voters remember during the general. And that Donald Trump in particular is going to come back and hit you with really hard in the general. So that would be my explanation of it, but it seems to me in terms of the best interest of the Democratic Party that it's not particularly prudent to be making some of these, statements that are pretty far out there in terms of where even the Democratic voters are.
In regards to Roe versus Wade, I believe you said Trump is more pro-life.
He's presented himself as pro-life.
My concern is when we start telling people that they can't have abortions or can't do what they want with their bodies, then we're going to get to a point to where it's like, hey, you got to be cut off and you can't have as many kids as you want because of overpopulation and so forth. What do you think about that?
So, look, there is an asymmetry I see between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party on the question of life, which is a very divisive, contentious question that is a very serious moral question. I mean, regardless of wherever anyone comes down, I hope each side can understand that, the right's argument is that it's a baby that's being killed, and the left's argument is it's my body and I should do what I want with it. And these are powerful moral arguments, and I think each side should be capable of respecting the other side's argument. The asymmetry I see is the following one. The left argues that there is a right to life, a right to choose in the Constitution. It's not written there, so they kind of need to get it out of the penumbras and the synergies of the clauses. By and large, the Republican Party says, actually, the Constitution has no right to choose, but it also doesn't have a right to life. The Constitution is agnostic. The states decide. And so I think the rights approach, there are some exceptions, I will concede. Some constitutional scholars on the right argue, no, actually, there is a right to life. It grows out of the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause. Professor Geisler is the one who really can get into the finer details of con law. I'm not going to try to go head to head with him on this one. He can explain better than me. But the general view is, we think Roe is a bad ruling because there is no right to choose in the Constitution. We want the states to decide. And then Vermont can do what Vermont wants to do, and then Texas can do what Texas wants to do. And we will have a live and let live approach, which, by the way, this is where, I will reveal my partisan nature perhaps. I find that the right is much more live and let live in America than the left is. I find that the right, on pretty much all of the issues, gay marriage, hate speech, healthcare, the minimum wage, abortion, the view tends to be the Constitution doesn't address this. Let the states decide. This is a big country. It's a continent. Okay, you look at a map of the world, America's a continent. We got 50 states. We are not going to agree on everything. Let's agree to disagree. Let's do federalism. Texas is Texas, Vermont is Vermont, and if you hate living in Texas, you move to Vermont, or you win elections and you try to make Texas into Vermont, and so on and so forth. This would be a way to de-escalate our national politics, because right now it's Armageddon every day on every issue. What if we said, look, let's have kind of a standoff. Some issues we can't have 50 different voices. Foreign policy. Okay, I can't have Texas declare war on Canada, Alabama sign a peace treaty with Guatemala. That would be a catastrophe. Foreign policy, we speak in one voice. But on pretty much every other issue, the Constitution doesn't talk about most of these issues. It really lets the states decide. So I think that the conservative Republican solution would be let the states decide. Young man.
So my question was, during your Democratic side of your speech with the Democrats of the identities, do you think they threaten our First Amendment with all these identities? Because it feels like almost with all these labels and all these words that it feels like it's harder to speak and that you're going to get slandered or you're going to get, like comedians, for example, if they tell a joke that people don't like,
yeah,
completely ran through the streets and parading. So do you think that...
So you've got three things going on here. The first thing is, should we criminalize hate speech? So America today is the only Western nation in the world that does not have laws that ban hate speech. You may say, well, why don't we? What's good about hate speech? Why would you want to use racial slurs or why would you want to deny the Holocaust? One thing you need to realize is you look at the countries in Europe or in Canada where I'm from, hate speech comes to mean an awful lot of conservative or Christian speech. So if a Christian wants to say, hey, look, it's a free country, people do what they want, I obey the laws, but I believe that marriage is the union of a man and a woman, well, in some countries they say that's hate speech. Or in other places they'll say, look, I think we should have less immigration. And they'll say that's hate speech. So hate speech comes to become a pretty expansive concept that is not about banning the N-word or really saying nasty things in public. It becomes a way to prevent deliberation on the major political questions confronting the country. We, thankfully, in America, do not have laws banning hate speech, and the Supreme Court, up until now, has been strong in protecting free speech. 2 years ago, there was a case that came before it, Mattal v. Tam, and it was an 8-0 ruling that hate speech is protected speech. It's not necessarily good speech, you may not like it, but we protect all speech. And the Democratic Party generally says, we protect free speech, but we condemn hate speech. I did look up before my talk here, I looked at the Texas Democratic Party platform. And they come pretty close to calling for the criminalization of hate speech. So there is a nascent movement to ban hate speech, but it doesn't have much legs right now. The problem that you point out to is really the law of public opinion. You're allowed in America today to make a tasteless remark about any ethnic group, but we have lost our sense of humor in America when it comes to joking about women, minorities, the LGBTQ. We get offended very quickly, and the Twitter mobs come down on you. and they ask for you to be fired, and people call you a Nazi, and then, you know, your whole life explodes overnight. It's interesting, I mentioned this SNL comedian, so he made disparaging remarks on a podcast about Asians. Andrew Yang came to his defense and said, look, I'm an Asian American. I have been subjected to racism, but I think that we Americans are going a little bit over the top in this, you know, everyone's a Nazi who says anything that anyone finds offensive. You know, how you deal with that one, this is no longer a legal issue. It's a public opinion issue. I want to make clear, I am not in favor of disparaging and demeaning fellow citizens in public, but man, this is America, you know, I mean, we should be able to speak freely, and if someone is making dumb racist jokes, then don't listen to him. Don't go to his comedy show. You know, go to someone else's. The third dimension is big tech. So look, I have very serious concerns that Google, Twitter, and Facebook, they have a political agenda. It is definitely progressive and definitely anti-conservative. We don't really know, however, what their operations are or how their algorithms work. And right now when they say we're going to deplatform you, right? We're going to kick you off of Facebook, kick you off of Twitter, we're going to delist your site on Amazon, they go after really bad people, okay? Basically neo-Nazis. But do you trust Google to stop there? I don't know. I mean, we're in this interesting position where we have these private corporations that are not subject to the First Amendment. Remember, the First Amendment is about government banning speech. Private corporations can do what they want, that are clearly affecting speech. I mean, Google controls 90% of the search traffic in America today. They basically control the information that we Americans see. Now, how are they using that power? Honestly, we don't know. There are a lot of anecdotes that they're going after conservatives, but because we don't know what the algorithm is, because they're a private company and their data is kept secret, we, the American people, just don't know what they're doing. And I will admit that I find this concerning, that a private company that has so much power over information, you know, it's one thing if they controlled 90% of diaper sales in America. I could live with that. They're controlling the flow of information, so I'm not calling for censorship, for regulations, or for breaking them up, but it seems to me that Republicans and Democrats, for the health of our democracy, should care about how are these corporations handling this immense power they have over the flow of information. And there are a handful of voices in DC that are waking up to this. Elizabeth Warren is one of them, and Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri is another one. But they remain, honestly, minority voices in the party, but I would like to think that this should be a bipartisan issue, that we should really protect free speech and the free flow of information.
Let's give a final round to Dr. Azerrad.
Thank you very much.
There are free copies of the Constitution on your way out on the front tables. Please take one. Have a good rest of your day.